When you hear Native American, what do you think of first? Go ahead, take a few seconds and think about it. If you aren't a Native person, depending on the level of interaction with Native people you have in your daily life, I can probably guess what images ran through your head. Did you think of headdresses and powwows? Spiritual leaders with a special connection to nature? There may have even been thoughts about casinos, poverty, or alcohol abuse. Honestly, none of these would be completely wrong. Because there is truth in all of it. There is beauty in some of it, and guess what? I've heard it all. As a Native person, I have encountered all these stereotypes and have had conversations about what is truth, myth, and outright racist. After many of these conversations, I started to wonder where such misconceptions come from and how they persist even in 2022. In looking back at my own experience, I find that even I have been misinformed about Native Americans, about my own people. Yad she ejol via yenisha, tzadiskijin yenishle, nakegla bashis chin, tabaha dasha che ador nakadene dashanele. Hi, my name is Joel Villa. I am of Navajo, Pima, and Mexican descent. I primarily grew up on the Navajo reservation, although I frequently visited the Gila River Reservation where my dad's family lived. Suffice it to say, I was a reservation kid. While my dad was a pastor in a Pentecostal church for the entirety of my childhood, I did learn about my heritage at school. Schools on the reservation made an effort to include Navajo language as part of the curriculum and included a lot of Native American history in history class. This is something I later found out was not the norm for a lot of schools in the US. Also, most of the people that lived in my community were also Native, or at the very least were mixed. So most of my life was spent around people like me. When I was 14, I went to boarding school in Connecticut, along with my best friend from middle school. This is where I really started to see what the rest of the country believed about Native Americans. I vividly remember freshman year in the girls' dorm. I was talking to a friend of mine. We were sitting in the hallway because the boys were not allowed to go into the girls' rooms. And I started talking about where I grew up. When my friend heard that my other friend who moved with me, that she and I were Native, she would not accept it. At first she laughed as if we were joking. When she saw that we were serious, it turned into her vehemently denying that any Native people were still alive. If I remember correctly, it took her a day or two to finally accept the truth. While it was a shock at the time, I really didn't start thinking about that conversation until I was older. I started to wonder how someone who lived in this country could not know that natives were still alive. Slowly, over the years, I started to discover what other schools were teaching about U.S. history and how it was very different from what I learned on the reservation. As I absorbed myself into popular culture, I also started to realize how invisible natives are in popular media. So a big question naturally arose. Without proper native representation in our education system, where are people supposed to learn about us? And that would be from whatever media they consumed, where representation is not great either. Let's look back at the images we have seen of Native Americans in the media. Focusing mostly on film and television, we can categorize Native characters into a few types that I am condensing here. The savage and or the naive, the mythical and fantastical, the spiritual leaders and environmentalist, and the promiscuous woman. Let's take it back to what many believe to be the origin of the stereotype. Many believe that the depiction of Indian people as savages in film and television started with Buffalo Bill's Wild West shows in the 1880s. In these shows, Buffalo Bill would parade Indians out and reenact famous battles between native tribes and the U.S. Army. The Indian actors would attack coaches or camps and ultimately be defeated to fanfare from the audience. These shows influenced depictions of Indian characters in old Western movies. Brian Young, a Navajo actor, talks about these beginnings in a Time article. He writes, "Silver screen tales about defeating Native American tribes proved to be hugely popular, so Hollywood churned them out. In most Westerns, white cowboys represent the shining future, whereas Indians are the dimming past. Cowboys are logical, Indians are irrational." In 1913, the Battle of Elderbush Gulch by D.W. Griffith represented Native Americans as stupid and savage. This silent movie was one of the first images of natives on film, and it started this narrative in film that continued for decades. These movies continued to perpetuate the narrative of the savage Indian, most notably in Stagecoach in 1939. In television, The Lone Ranger began airing in 1949 and featured the character of Tonto, an Indian sidekick. He was painted as a submissive partner who was easily pushed around. And we won't even mention the backlash the 2013 Lone Ranger movie got for casting Johnny Depp as Tonto. In the following years, representation in these Western films softened, and we began seeing Indians painted as unfortunate characters who fell victim to settlers and colonizers. In 1962, the movie Geronimo showed a more sympathetic portrayal of the Apache leader, and placed more blame on the white opponents in the film. This narrative continues in movies like Dances with Wolves in 1990 and The Last of the Mohicans in 1992. While a lot of these newer movies still fall prey to white savior tropes, especially in a movie like Dances with Wolves, we still see a notable shift in representation. I want to make a point to also call out One Who Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, released in 1975, where Will Sampson portrays an Indian character who has more agency and intelligence than we have previously seen. While we have seen progress in representation, we still have a ways to go. Let's not forget the widely panned Cowboys and Aliens in 2011, where the native characters were pushed to the background and were only put in the movie for spiritual direction. I believe the representation of natives as fantastical creatures is what leads people like my classmate in high school, and I'm sure many others, to believe Native Americans are all dead. And if they are still alive, they live in buckskins and teepees. The most notable example of this is in the 1953 Disney film Peter Pan. One of my earliest memories is watching Disney movies, especially Peter Pan. What is very interesting to me is that the depiction of the Indian tribe never bothered me. I thought it was an outlandish caricature of native tribes, and I believe that no one could ever think this was real. I mean, they put this tribe alongside mermaids and pixies. As I look back, I realize that for some people, this was the only image of American Indians that they knew. It's no wonder that when I moved to Connecticut, I was asked if I lived in teepees or wigwams, or if I smoked peyote and hunted buffalo. This fantasy that was being created was no better than the naive savage that the Old West films created. When Pocahontas came out, I was excited, because we finally had a Native American princess in the Disney world. But as I encountered the ignorance about Native peoples and our way of life, I again looked back and saw how the magical elements of Pocahontas skewed the narrative. Well, skewed it more than it already was. Fast forward to Jacob Black in the Twilight Saga. His tribe were shape-shifting werewolves who battled vampires. As fantasy, it is an intriguing story, but in a world where Indians are already mythologized in popular media, does this actually contribute to the wrong narrative? Is this the image some people have of Native culture, even in the 21st century? Before I get to one of the most troubling stereotypes of Indian women, I want to touch on a depiction of Native people as spiritual leaders and environmentalists. This topic is tricky because for many Native people, this representation is true. But the issue is less about how true it is, and instead how Western culture tends to lump all tribes together as one unit. The US government recognizes 574 tribes. It would be ridiculous to think that every tribe will have the same beliefs as each other. Still, this blanket idea of spiritualism happens, and it likely stems from the representation we see of American Indians in film and TV. In Cowboys and Aliens, we see this trope of troubled white travelers or settlers going to the Indians for guidance and being told to go on some sort of vision quest to find a truth or a part of themselves. Oftentimes, these involve hallucinogenics and sweat lodges. While some tribes do practice this, I often come across people who believe this is widely practiced and that spirit animals are ubiquitous to all Native people. Movies like Pocahontas show the environmental side of Indians. While this movie dips into the perceived magic of Native culture with a character like Grandmother Willow, a more prevalent message of the film is in the way the tribe, namely Pocahontas, tries to educate the settlers on the importance of nature and preservation. In King of the Hill, John Redcorn is a local native who people look to for spiritual guidance and healing with his practices and medicines. As a side note, he is also depicted as living in a trailer and has a long-term affair with the white wife of one of the main characters, and even has a son with her. Again, spiritual practice and environmentalism exist within many tribal beliefs, but it becomes a main point of identification for natives instead of a beautiful part of the culture. Think of the 1970 Keep America Beautiful commercial that leaned into this trope, creating the now widely recognized character of the crying Indian, placing a buckskin-dressed native in a canoe against a modern Western world. The storyline of Native women being sexually available to men is one of the most harmful images that has been shown in film and television. In 1914, The Squaw Man, an early silent film about Native American interaction with white men, tells a story of an Indian princess named Naturich, who encounters a man in distress and decides to save him. She nurses him back to health, at which point they fall in love. Eventually they marry and have a child. By the end of the film, circumstances result in Naturich committing suicide. In the 1950 film Broken Arrow, the idea of taking a native wife is romanticized when the main character meets and marries a young Apache woman named Sansi Ray. Their love is star-crossed, and the tensions between the cowboys and the Apaches result in the death of Sansi Ray, interestingly at the hands of other Apaches. Probably the most referenced film about the promiscuous Native woman in distress is Pocahontas. Her storyline revolves around aiding John Smith, teaching him, and eventually saving him because she loves him. The way she is drawn sexualizes the character and is a point of attraction for John Smith. She is curvy in a short skirt. She has long, slick, black hair and pouty lips. The real life of Pocahontas is even worse. She was abducted at 15 and taken to England, where she married an Englishman and was paraded around parties as an exotic oddity. Outside of film, we see Native women's costumes sexualized for Halloween, or famously in the Victoria's Secret fashion show. In these versions, the women are nearly naked, usually with headdresses and turquoise jewelry. Now that we have covered how bad representation has looked over the years, it's important to discuss why working toward change is important. In 2018, Crystal Echohawk co-led the Reclaiming Native Truth R&T study, which aimed to show how creating improved visibility for Native peoples can create greater support for issues that affect these communities. In an article in Variety, she wrote that negative and inaccurate stereotypes and tropes and systematic erasure have informed the wrong perceptions, attitudes, and behaviors towards Native peoples. She sums up some of the findings in the R&T study in the following statement. We found that the invisibility of and toxic misconceptions about Native peoples create very serious biases within people and institutions, which impact everything from court decisions to police violence. Invisibility, perpetuated in pop culture, media, and K-12 education, has a harmful effect on the mental health and well-being of Native youth. Native mascots, which continue to exist in professional sports and in schools across the country, are drivers of bias, and stereotype Native people as aggressive and caricatures of the past. The NRT study produced statistics that show the low percentage of Native representation in media. And it produced insights on how little most people in this country know about Native Americans, and that they have a desire to learn more.
Number one finding was that erasure is really the greatest threat that Native Americans face, and upwards to 80% of Americans know little to nothing about Native peoples. And if you don't live in proximity to a reservation, a lot of Americans aren't even sure if Native Americans exist anymore. We also found that 72% of Americans rarely or never encounter any information about Native Americans, and that almost 90% of the schools in the country don't teach about us past 1900. So generation after generation of Americans really are conditioned to think that we don't exist anymore. And even if it's not intentional, we're getting left out of major conversations.
In 2015, another study produced similar statistics and findings. The study was published in a Journal of Social Issues and is titled Frozen in Time: The Impact of Native American Media Representation on Identity and Self-Understanding. It focused on how mass media influences Native American self-perception. In a summary of the study's findings, an article in the journalist resource adds, inaccurate and negative media depictions have psychological consequences. For example, exposure to common media portrayals has been shown to have a harmful impact on Native American high school students' feelings about themselves, their community, and their academic possibilities. The lack of accurate representation is heightened by the fact that the average U.S. resident experiences nearly no direct daily interaction with Native Americans. Only 14 states have American Indian populations that exceed 100,000 people. Nearly one-fourth of Native people live on reservations. On the topic of high school students, a 2014 study by Center for American Progress showed that derogatory team mascots and names had an effect on Native students' self-perception. In an article discussing their study, they point out these issues. American Indian, Alaska Native communities struggle with poverty at nearly double the national rate, have some of the lowest high school graduation rates in the country, and suffer from extreme health disparities. Perhaps most disturbing, suicide is the second leading cause of death for American Indian Alaska Native youth ages 15 to 24, a rate that is 2.5 times higher than a national average. Specifically on the topic of Native women representation in media, the fetishization and hypersexual images created in media do not help the issues that these women face on a daily basis. In 2013, the National Congress of American Indians released statistics on violence against Native women. Some of the most astounding numbers shown there include American Indian Alaska Native women are 2.5 times more likely to experience violent crimes compared to other races. 34% of American Indian Alaska Native women will be raped in their lifetime. Among Native women rape and sexual assault victims, on average, 67% describe the offender as non-Native. On some reservations, Native women are murdered at more than 10 times the national average. U.S. attorneys declined to prosecute nearly 52% of violent crimes that occurred in Indian country, and 67% of cases declined were sexual abuse-related cases. It is a stretch to create a direct connection from representation to all the issues the Indian community faces. But better representation would increase visibility on these issues and hopefully increase support to address them. Historically, that support has not always been there. In my opinion, the pipeline protests at Standing Rock had some of the most support I've seen in a long time. And I would love to see that support for other issues, like the ongoing fight to give back lands to tribes who were forcibly displaced, the increasing number of missing Native women across the country, and many more issues that one video could never cover completely. We are seeing improvements in the last few decades. I remember seeing smoke signals in 1998. I was sitting in the theater, and for the first time, I saw myself on screen. I saw myself in a depiction of reservation life that only those who've lived it would understand. And in that moment, I finally felt like I could aim for something more than just a life I'd been living and felt relegated to. In a SAG-AFTRA panel on Native representation, Kimberly Guerrero spoke on this shared experience when she watched The Doughboy and saw a representation of herself as a child on screen.
Big screen. And then The Doughboy was the last one. The Doughboy is based in Oklahoma. I'm a little Indian girl from Oklahoma. And the opening sequence opened up, and there was a little Indian boy running through the woods with a bow and arrow. I am still, but was as a child, an incredibly tomboy-ish young girl. Now I would have no problem. Like, gender neutral was like, yes, I'm all over that. But back then, tomboy. And I saw this little boy running through the woods, in my Oklahoma woods, with my boy haircut that I had. I mean, it was basically me. And it was around my era and I went into a panic attack, and my husband looked at me and he's, asked me what was wrong. I never had a panic attack in my life. I couldn't breathe. The tears came to my eyes. I had to run out of the theater, which is really embarrassing because the whole theater was full. I had to run out of the theater through the exit. And I just remember coming to consciousness against a brick wall, going, what's going on? What's going on? And my husband came after, and he said, and finally I said, I've never seen myself. I've never seen myself. And it was after seeing Smoke Signals and then The Doughboy and realizing for the first time how much I missed that story, how much I missed seeing myself.
We also see our stories represented in films like Adenarjuat, The Fast Runner, and TV shows like Reservation Dogs and Rutherford Falls. TikTok videos have become a popular place for Native artists to educate others on their cultures. And as we continue to allow Native storytellers to have space, we will see this more. There are organizations like Illuminative and Vision Maker Media that aim to make space for Native storytellers in an effort to further the good representation and narrative. In speaking on the importance of representation, Koriyanka Kilcher said it eloquently.
Being indigenous, we have such a rich culture, and it can be overwhelming to people that look at us and they don't know really how to place us, and then we end up getting pushed into almost becoming like a relic in a museum where they don't know what to do with us other than, we get pushed into the stereotype that we need a feather in our hair, buckskins, being on horses and stuff. But I think, by educating people on who we really are, we are breaking down the long history of stereotypes that we have, endured for a very long time. Because, today we are doctors, we are lawyers, we are baristas at your Starbucks.
We are theater makers. We are filmmakers. We are more than what mass media has presented us as. As a future storyteller, I understand the importance of creating a legacy with my own path in life and creating a space for my people's stories to shine in the best way possible, whether that be from my experience or the experiences of my community. I am proud to be Navajo. I am proud to be Pima. I am proud to be Native, and I'm proud of the stories that I have to tell. So I will leave you with this. We are all storytellers. And when we tell our stories, people listen. They respond to it. They carry that story with them. So, what stories will you tell? And how will you tell them?